Let's talk about infantry. Or more specifically, when is it worth it to do a leg attack or a swarm attack versus just shooting? In this video, we will go into some of the mathematical game theory and calculations regarding when it makes sense to make special attacks and when it doesn't. But don't worry, I'll keep everything really simple. There'll be no fancy equations, none of that stuff here. It'll just be talk and things that make sense. But assuming you are a self-respecting game player, you will at least have had some thought about the 2d6 probability distribution. And unless you want to be a super hardcore gamer, you don't really need to memorize these tables or anything. But it is helpful if you do, but you don't need to. You can just kind of think about things and realize that if you're on the tail end of the distribution, the effect of small changes and small bonuses is very large. And in case I have piqued your interest, but you don't physically own any infantry units for tabletop, you can actually still find them on eBay sometimes, very rarely, but yes, you can actually get them. Usually you only see like battle armor and power armor, but every once in a while you will get stands of infantry, just like you see here on this shot here of an eBay sale. Needless to say, it's almost always considerably more expensive than whatever sticker price there is on whatever obsolete blister pack is being sold. But you can still get pretty good deals. Like here, this was like many stands for just $22. That's pretty good. Sometimes for infantry, you might end up spending $10 for a single stand. Also, in order to understand when it's a theoretically good time to do a leg attack versus a swarm attack, you have to first look at, well, how does infantry actually do damage? Standard infantry attacks are always grouped into 2-point groups. So if you look up this table and say 20 troopers, it's an LRM platoon, you look here and you see 9. That means you supposedly do 9 points of damage, but really it's 4 groups of 2 points and 1 group of 1 point. And that is very important because it alters the logic of when it's better to do a leg attack or a swarm attack versus when it's better to just shoot. I'm hoping that by the end of this video, you understand exactly why, and you have like a deep mathematical intuition as to what makes sense and why things happen the way they do when you shoot with infantry. Or even if you don't have the intuition quite built up yet, you will at least know, maybe if you have to refer back to this video to remind yourself or whatnot, but how to do the calculations to figure out the intuition. You'll be able to actually put numbers down to decide, does it make sense to shoot versus leg attack in this specific exact situation? There is one thing you have to be aware of though, like for power armor units, like the level 1 of Purifier, you actually shoot with one unit as if it was shooting its weapon like a mech, but then you treat the troopers as if they were a cluster weapon. So if you've got 6 troopers, you then look up the cluster hits table and you roll on that to determine how many of them hit. So you treat it kind of like a rotary autocannon. And again, by the end of this video, I'm hoping you will know what calculation you need to do to compensate for the fact that you're using power armor instead of conventional infantry. It's the same logic, the same calculation, just with this alteration in what's called a utility function for the game theory. So we'll get to that, and hopefully it'll all make sense. If you watched my video on the Omega and looked through the battle replay part at the end, there's a scene in which an infantry unit, it happens to be a power armor squad of purifiers, makes a leg attack. And it's important to notice that there are 6 troopers in that unit. This is important because of reasons you'll understand soon. And so in my code, I have this function that calculates the probability of success for 2d6. It's basically just a lookup table for the AI to make decisions. Like, what is your chances of beating a certain roll? Like, you'll never get a 13 on 2d6. Your probability of getting a 13 or above is exactly 0. But you have a roughly 41.6% chance of getting an 8 or better. It's kind of like in this function that I've coded up. So you don't need to memorize this table, but if you do, you can play better, just like as if you play poker and you memorize certain probabilities and certain combinations, you will play better. You also have to kind of know what a leg attack is, and basically the main thing is it'll do 4 points of damage to one of the legs and get a free crit roll, and that crit roll is the key feature. The swarm attack is almost like the punching version of the leg attack, whereas the leg attack only hits legs, the swarm attack only hits the upper body. Whereas a leg attack is a one-time event, a swarm attack is an ongoing event. So the very first turn when you do your swarm attack, you don't actually do any damage, you just activate a swarm. The next turn, if the swarm is active, and from then on forever onward, you always hit. So you no longer do hit rolls. It's like you always hit. You're only rolling where you do the hit. And the other key feature of the swarm attack is all the damage goes into the same one location. It does not get split up into 2-point groups like with a standard shooting. And also, a mech has only limited options to deal with a swarm attack. A mech either has to have jump jets, or it needs to have hand actuators, or it can throw itself on the ground and thrash. That's it. It cannot shoot at itself. This means that the mathematical logic for the swarm attack utility function calculation depends on whether or not the target mech has hand actuators and jump jets or not. So a standard Marauder or standard Timberwolf are good targets for swarm attacks. And once the swarm attack starts, every turn the mech takes more and more damage, unless the swarm attack ends because the infantry unit voluntarily drops off the mech, or the mech is able to remove the swarm attack through one of those methods. And this means, as a player, you will need to adjust your utility function for the swarm attack based on what assisting nearby mechs there are on the enemy's team, as well as the status of the hand actuators and jump jets on the target. Okay, we're almost ready to start doing actual calculations, but first we're going to look up the modifiers for the size of the troopers. So if you've got a conventional platoon, you want to make sure that you're at 22 or more troopers, and the other threshold is around 16, and finally another one at 10. And for battle armor, you want to be at 4, 5, or 6 troopers, although in theory you can do it with less. For swarm attacks, the thresholds are a little harsher because the modifiers are worse, so you really need to be at like 22 troopers or 4+ battle armor active in your platoon. And that's because we will likely be on the tail end of the 2d6 distribution, so small bonuses make huge differences in the probabilities of success. So what's the right decision for a trooper? Well, this trooper here is pondering his strategy. Although for anti-mech attacks you need to have a battle claw or a magnetic battle claw. Otherwise, it's not as good. Go through the theory. I'm actually going to go through the code that I wrote up for my artificial intelligence for the infantry, and I'll talk through it, and then it should start making sense to you what the right logic is. The basic overall flow of the logic is you need to know what the probability of success is for any action you take, and also what the value of success if you hit for that action. What is the actual utility of that action? So to start off, just figure out what is your rough to hit target number to start off with. I mean, as a basic player, even if you've only played a little bit, you're gonna, after a while, kind of start thinking in terms of these numbers. Oh, you walked, the target didn't move or moved this many hexes. Therefore, you've got these extra +2 or +3. Then you've got your basic gunnery score, which you will need to use to calculate your probability of success for just shooting, and compare that to your anti-mech score, which hopefully you've trained, but if you didn't train it, it doesn't matter. You still use the same logic and same calculations. It just leads you to a different result, and you want to know what that number is too. And assuming you're using like a standard infantry unit, your gunnery score is typically going to be 4, and your anti-mech score is going to be typically 8. Or if you've taken the anti-mech training, your anti-mech score will be 5. So step 1, figure out what your rough starting to hit number is based on the target modifiers, your training modifiers. So there's what is your hit target for leg, swarm versus just shoot? Next step, figure out what probabilities these correspond to. Now, you're not realistically going to be able to do this on the fly in the heat of a battle, but you can kind of pre-calculate some cooked up scenarios in your mind and then kind of keep those ratios of probabilities in mind. Next, you need to figure out what the actual value or the utility of your actions is, assuming success. Now, just for shooting, that's pretty easy. I just assign that to be how much damage your platoon can do with its maximum damage. Now, technically, you would have to adjust for cluster hits, because even though if you're swarming, you always hit, you still have to check to see how many troopers actually hit from the cluster table each time. But then you apply all that damage to the same one location, I believe. But this is now where you, as a human being with a brain, gets to actually put in some numbers, and you kind of get to make them up based on your opinion. So for a leg attack, I have assigned the utility of damage to be 4, but that's only assuming the legs have lots of armor and you're not going to penetrate and both legs are intact. Now, if the legs are about to fall off, that 4 points of damage is much more valuable, so you can add a scaling factor to increase that. You just do that in your head. It's like, it's only going to do 4 points of damage, but I'm going to treat it like 10 points of damage because one of the legs is about to fall off. Also, you have almost a 50% chance of a crit. So depending on the status of the leg, is there ammo in that leg, or is it just actuators? So, and is this a mech? Is this like an assault mech that's got 26 points of armor on its leg, and it's very hard to take down, but you could cripple its motion from speed 3.5 to maybe a 2.3 if you were to take out an actuator. In that case, it has additional utility. So you get to assign the utility based on your personal opinion. And how good you are at assigning this utility is kind of what determines how good of a player you are, even though you don't consciously do that, like numerically. How well you guess as to the value of your actions is what defines you as a good or bad player. Just like with a poker game, it's like you take good and bad risks, but if you take them at the right level, at the right rate, then you're a good player. And the same thing is true for swarm attacks. You can just take your expected damage and use that as your utility function, but you may want to scale it up or down depending on what's happening. If the target mech doesn't have hand actuators or something and doesn't have jump jets, you might double it or triple or even multiply by 10 times the damage when you decide on utility. And if the enemy mech has both jump jets and hands, and maybe there's even some mechs that are friendly to that enemy mech, but of course your enemy, who might even be able to help get rid of your infantry, well, then your utility function is going to be even lower. So, because your swarm attack won't do much damage before your infantry is removed. So therefore, you get to make up the utility function based on your soft skills of just looking at the table and imagining what's happening and the status of the arms and actuators and hands and jump jets on the target, as well as how many friendly units to the target are around the target, and you use those as multipliers on your damage utility function. Okay, so now you have cooked up your probabilities of success for your actions. That is your leg attack versus your swarm attack versus your just shooting attack. And you have got some idea as to the value or the utilities based on success. Assuming you actually hit, the utility of your shooting is just how much damage your infantry does. The utility of a leg attack is how much like 4 points times some modifier based on the condition and the value of you getting a crit on the target. And the value of your swarm attack is going to be some more complicated function of how much damage your infantry does times some multiplier that either shifts it up or down based on how many enemies there are in the area that can help and whether or not the target has actually lost its hand actuators and things like that. So that you can come up with actual mathematical values for the utilities and probabilities. So, can you do this in real time? Hell no. I can't do it in real time. And I always thought of myself as being pretty smart. I don't think anyone can do it in real time. But you can kind of pre-can up some scenarios up. It's like, okay, well, if you're going to be playing with infantry and you're going to do anti-mech training and anti-mech attacks, well, you can kind of cook up some situations where, okay, you've got a marauder and nobody else is around, or you've got a mech that's got hands and no one else is around. You are still at mostly full strength, and you're right here. What are your chances of success for a leg attack versus a swarm attack versus a shooting, and what are the values of success? And you can just kind of keep those like few scenarios in mind and kind of dynamically just modify those just from your intuition when you're actually playing. So how do you actually choose the actual action that you take? Because a leg attack, a swarm attack, and a shooting action are very different, and each one of them has kind of a niche role, it's always a possibility that any of those three actions are still worth it. So I don't like to exclude any of them. So what I want to do is weigh my odds of taking any one of those actions based on the product of how valuable it is and the probability of success. And so if, for example, just shooting, the product of its value times its probability of success is 5 times greater than the probability of success times the value of a leg attack, And there's basically no hope of a swarm attack working because the modifiers are wrong, so it's basically a 0% chance of success in this scenario. If that ratio is like 5 to 1, then I will just roll a 1d6, and if it's a 1, then I will choose the low probability action, and if it's anything else, I take the high probability action. There is a formal game theory concept called like a mixed equilibrium optimum strategy within something called a Nash equilibrium game theory that kind of formalizes all of this. But I'm not going to bother getting into that. If you really want to get into like game theory, you can go look that stuff up. Actually, you probably have to take some college courses on game theory or find some advanced texts on it. But whatever, you can. It is possible for you to study it. Now, when I call this stuff game theory, it's not really meant to be for BattleTech, although it applies, obviously, being that you can use game theory for playing games, but it applies to anything. I mean, it applies to whether or not you marry somebody, you can, like, whether or not you ask for a raise, whether you buy a house, whether you buy a certain stock, I mean, like, what kinds of actions you take in front of your boss. You could perhaps flicking off your boss is beneficial if they're a psychopath, and you might actually look good in their eyes. I mean, you can create a game theory matrix for any actions in your life and have your probabilities of what happens here if you succeed, what happens there if you fail. And the success might have a large positive number in it, and the failure might have a large negative number in it. And you go through this matrix and figure out what action you should take based on whether you succeed or you fail, and your probabilities of success and failure, and you can calculate what your best action is. And it's got nothing to do with BattleTech, but you can use this game theory for BattleTech. Just whatever you do, just don't ever tell your wife that you married her because you rolled a d20 and you got an 18 when you rolled the d20. But in theory, you can actually live your life in this way. And you can mathematically prove that if you were to live thousands of repeated lives, you would be better off if you optimized your game theory in your life. Now, of course, whenever you roll dice or generate random numbers and make decisions, well, sometimes you win, sometimes you lose. But what I want to know is, if you're going up against the Steiner Scout Squad, which I used to believe was 4 Atlases, but now I actually suspect is specifically 1 Atlas, 1 Banshee, and 2 Zeuses, what should you do? And why do I think that's the composition of the true Steiner Scout Squad? Because it's in the 4th Succession War scenario pack. There are 4 Steiner assault mechs out on patrol, and it's called the Rise of the Revenant. That's the name of the specific scenario. I had to pause there and break that up because I couldn't remember it and I had to go look it up, but that's what it is. And it's basically 4 Steiner assault mechs against a crap loads of Kurita jumping mechs. The funny part is I even did a video on that particular scenario quite a long time ago. I think it was more than a year ago. And I've even fought that battle a couple times. And until recently, it did not hit me that that was actually the true Steiner Scout Squad.